Welcome to the Fibrolamellar Cancer Foundation's webinar on clinical trials, the patient perspective. Hi, I'm John Hopper, the foundation's president. Our foundation's mission is threefold: to support research towards finding a cure, to educate and build awareness around fibrolamellar, and third, to foster and support an active patient community. Tonight's event supports this mission and is part of an ongoing series addressing topics important to our patient and caregiver community, with the opportunity to hear from key opinion leaders and fellow fibro fighters. Importantly, we hope topics like this will empower you as you make choices in your journey, noting the foundation does not and cannot give medical advice. To learn more about the foundation's other activities, to find ways to interact with other fibro fighters through our recently launched Fibro Connect program, and to share your thoughts on future topics, please go to the resource tab on our website, which is fibrofoundation.org. We'd love to hear from you. Now, tonight, we have an exceptional panel discussing clinical trials. We have Dr. Mark Yarchoan, who's an assistant professor of oncology at the Johns Hopkins Sidney Kimmel Comprehensive Cancer Center. Among his many responsibilities, Mark co-leads the Johns Hopkins Liver Cancer Multidisciplinary Clinic and is the principal investigator in multiple clinical trials, including the current FLC immunotherapy trial. We have Dr. Richard Weinberg, the professor of gastroenterology at Wake Forest School of Medicine. Dr. Weinberg is also the executive chair of the Institutional Review Board, or what we like to call the IRB, at Wake Forest. We have Emily Barrett. Emily is a fibro fighter who recently participated in Dr. Yarchoan's trial and is here to share her journey pre, during, and post-clinical trial. It's an amazing story, so make sure you listen to every word she has to say. I was amazed when I heard her story. And we have Kurt Losert. Kurt is a longtime caregiver for his wife, Elizabeth, who participated in numerous clinical trials during her almost 14-year fibrolamellar fight. So thank you, panelists, for being part of this important event. Thank you, audience, for being part of this also. And now to lead the panel, it's my honor to introduce FCF Scientific Director, Dr. Mark Furth. Mark, you're on.
Thanks, John. And thanks very much to the panelists and to those who are attending the webinar. In a very rare cancer like fibrolamellar, where the only therapy that's been shown to, at least statistically, to extend life is surgery, every patient who gets any treatment other than surgery is, in a sense, participating in an experiment. But we're here to talk about more formal experiments, what are called clinical trials today, and to focus not on the science or the medicine of those trials, but to talk specifically about what's the patient experience. What does one have to do to become involved in clinical studies? What are the risks and benefits? How do you make the decision to do it? How do you find out about trials? And also to take from the eyes of physicians who know a lot about clinical trials, Mark Yarchoan and Richard Weinberg, to understand what is the underlying goal of a clinical trial? How does the physician work with the patients, or as they're called, subjects in a trial? And how are the rights and the safety of those subjects protected? I'd like to start by talking with Richard Weinberg, or asking him to talk. Richard, as you heard from John, is the executive chair of what's called the Institutional Review Board at the Wake Forest School of Medicine and the Associated Medical Center. And I'll disclose for accuracy that Richard and I know each other for many years because I actually served on that IRB when I was at Wake Forest and for my first couple of years while here at the foundation. I'd like to ask Richard to talk to you about what a clinical trial is, what an IRB is, and very specifically about how does the regulatory system strive to protect the rights and the safety of patients. Richard, thanks.
Well, thank you, Mark. It's a pleasure to be here, and I hope all of us can give very useful information for everyone attending this webinar. A clinical trial is an experiment that uses human beings. It is human subjects research. And because humans are involved, there are very special considerations that we have to take to protect everyone's rights, to protect their safety, and to ensure, to the extent we can, that the results of that experiment are valid and have meaning going forward. So in order for that to happen, and there's a very long history behind this that I could get into later, but suffice it to say that there are a series of governmental regulatory bodies that were established over the past century in response, I can say, to catastrophic events with unapproved drugs in the turn of the century and gross abuses of human rights throughout the second part of the 20th century. And these organizations include the Federal Drug Administration, the FDA, the Office of Human Rights Protections, which is a branch of NIH and Office of Civil Rights. And they've established rules which make a lot of ethical sense, but they're actually United States law that tell us how we have to conduct these experiments, these clinical trials, and how scientists have to evaluate them before they even start to make sure they're going to be ethical, that the rights of anyone who participates are protected to the maximum amount possible, and that when it's all over, regardless of the size and the length of the trial, the results have meaning, that they're not futile, they're not things that other people can't reproduce and use. In other words, that they generate knowledge that's useful to both patients and the medical community. So you'll hear about types of clinical trials, and they are structured in a system called phases. Phase 1, 2, and 3. And each phase has a particular length and goals. So a phase 1 trial is the first time any drug's ever been used in a human being. And you can't just fix something up in your basement or your lab and give it to a human being. You have to have both a biological and laboratory and very often animal basis to think that this drug could be useful for anything. And then if you want to give it to human beings, you have to make application to at least 2 of these governmental agencies, the Food and Drug Administration and the Ethics Board or Institutional Review Board of the organization in which you're conducting that trial. And both of those organizations are charged with making sure that it's reasonable to proceed with this the first time a human being gets a drug, and that the way it's done is ethical and moral. So a phase 1 trial, they're usually very small and they're usually very short. And the whole goal of those is, can we actually give this compound or chemical to a human being? And if we do, what are the side effects? And sometimes are those related to dose? So if you get through a phase 1 trial, now a phase 1 trial might be spectacularly successful. It might be the first time you're using a drug actually in sick people. Usually a phase 1 are healthy volunteers, but in the course of very rare diseases, very often a clinical trial is on patients themselves, as Dr. Yarchoan will talk about. The goal, again, is not to see how wonderful it works. It's to see if it's safe, but of course we keep an eye on that. Now, if at the end of a phase 1 trial, a drug looks promising, then you have a phase 2 trial, which usually are much larger, and the goal of which is specifically to test dosing, tolerance, and preliminary efficacy. Now, if you're talking about a drug for blood pressure, for example, or a diabetes drug, these trials can be much, much larger. But again, in the case of a very rare disease, you may not have that opportunity, and a phase 1 trial can easily sort of flow into a phase 2 trial. Finally, phase 3 trial, we've already established we can give the drug to human beings. It's safe. We know what doses we're going to use, and we know it's probably pretty effective. The phase 3 trial for, again, drugs, common drugs for common diseases, tests it against whatever is considered to be the best treatment available. Sometimes, depending on the severity of the disease, phase 3 trial will test a drug against a placebo or a fake drug, the sugar solution, if we're not sure if it might work or not. In the case of cancers, obviously you can't test something against nothing, and rarely are these trials conducted with placebos. That's, again, a difference when you're talking about cancers and rare diseases. At the end of those trials, if your drug is at least as good as whatever else is out there, then the FDA, after more consideration of all the data, will approve that drug for common use. Now, all along, the FDA might grant permission, but the other body that has to grant permission are the institutional review boards. These are constructed at each institution. So there are thousands of these boards across the country at medical schools and medical institutions and hospitals. And the government says who has to be on there. You have to have a mixture of people from different backgrounds, different genders, different expertise. And interestingly, one of the members of your board has to be a non-scientist, and one of them has to be someone who's just out in the community. And when we recruit people for this, they very often are puzzled. How can I be on a committee that's looking at a new drug? I'm not a scientist. And we tell them it's the same principle in which juries are impaneled. It's the common sense of the person on the street, because scientists can sometimes be blinded to obvious things. And of course, we all are expecting things to work, which constitutes a bias. So these committees together will look at a formal, what's called a protocol. A document says exactly what we're going to do. And this is always paired with a consent form. The subjects have to be informed of exactly what's going to happen. What are the risks? What are the benefits? And there are other elements to the consent. If everyone agrees, then these trials go forward. So that, in a nutshell, is the types of what clinical trials are and who looks over them. And very often people get frustrated, both patients and scientists, that there's all this red tape and bureaucracy. And we always reply that that there are tremendous financial penalties, like tens of thousands of dollars a day, that can be levied by the government for people who fall afoul of these rules or ignore them completely. All of the research at least a dozen major, very famous medical schools has been paused for months to years because people have not followed these rules. So we tell people when they get frustrated about the IRB, we're not the IRS auditor who's come to find your tax fraud. We're your accountant who goes with you to make sure that it's all done as best as you can. So that, in a nutshell, is what we do. I'm sure there'll be other questions, and I don't want to take too much more time.
Thanks, Richard. That's terrific help. And I neglected to say to our attendees that if you have questions, we'll come to a Q&A session, hopefully have about half an hour towards the end of the webinar for Q&A. But if you have questions, use the Q&A function on your screen. Just click on Q&A on the bottom for most of you, and you can post a question there, and I'll do my best to make sure that there's time for a response to as many questions as possible. But let me turn now to Mark Yarchoan. Mark, as somebody who has really devoted his career, still an early stage, but terrifically productive career as a physician scientist. You've been the principal investigator of a number of clinical trials, including one that's going on for fibrolamellar carcinoma. Could I ask you just to spend a very brief time saying what that trial is? And we won't ask you to give results today or anything that's really premature and that your own IRB would be unhappy about you talking about in public at this point. But just a little bit on that. And maybe more importantly, what is it that as a clinician scientist motivates you to run a clinical trial? What are you hoping to get out of it? What are you hoping to offer to the patients? And what are you hoping to offer to the science around this rare disease?
Yeah, thanks so much for the chance to speak. You'll probably hear a little bit more about this from Emily, who bravely was one of our first participants in our trial. But we have a trial for Fibrolamellar HCC. And again, I think it's amazing that we've gotten to the point that we have a trial specifically for this rare cancer. Our trial is an immunotherapy that uses a vaccine specifically for this cancer. It targets this unusual fusion event that happens in patients with this cancer, and it tries to get the immune system to see this cancer and attack it. It's what's called a phase 1 clinical trial. So just as you heard about, this is really a first in human clinical study. Although it's a concept that has been used for a long time in many cancers. So although it's new and it's the first time it's being applied to this cancer, it's not quite the same as some other phase 1 studies where it's really the first time that this idea goes into a person. So in our case, we're using something that's been used before. The dose has generally been figured out. The timing has generally been figured out. We're just switching the cancer and the specific antigen that we target. I think you asked me, why do we do clinical research? Why is this important? So this is something I'm obviously very passionate about. We have an increasing array of different tools against different cancers, and most of the drugs that we use, we can say that they work, and we can say they work because they've been studied in clinical trials. So everything that we use today that we believe in it because we've seen that it works in prospective clinical trials. Now, fibrolamellar cancer is a rare disease. We can also learn from patients who aren't in clinical trials. There are other ways to learn information, but if we really want to move the ball forward and study new treatments in a way that we're totally convinced that they work, I think that's going to require prospective clinical trials. And it's going to require patients to bravely participate in things that may not help them. It's something I share with patients. Obviously, we want trials to work for them. But the one thing that we can always guarantee when patients participate in a human clinical trial is that they will be helping other patients because we learn from each patient.
Mark, thank you for that. And let me address the next question to Emily. But Emily, first, I've got to say, Mark used the word brave a couple of times. And I can tell you from my own many years in research, not so much clinical, but also with 15 years under Richard's tutelage on an IRB, I can't overstate my respect for you and for every patient who participates in a clinical trial. It is a form of courage. It's a form of just looking out for your fellow human being. And we all know that because you're doing something that's an experiment, there's absolutely no guarantee it's going to work. There's no guarantee that it isn't going to make your situation maybe worse than it was when you started. But there you go. You have the guts and the humanity to participate, and just respect.
It really wasn't a hard decision to make when Dr. Yarchoan, sold it at such a good, place. So it was a lot to do with the way he explained it and told me exactly everything up front, that I felt like I really understood what it was, that's why I felt comfortable with it. And like he said, like, even if it didn't work, I knew that at the end, whether my results came out good or bad, I know that it was helping other people and it was making it an opportunity for someone else to use this drug, whether it worked for me or not. And I thought that was important.
Emily, that's terrific. And again, applaud that spirit. Let me ask you if you could take just a minute and walk us through a little bit of your journey with fibrolamellar. And most importantly, how did you come to learn of a clinical trial? And how did you come to decide that that was really the direction in which you wanted to learn more? And you already explained why you thought this one made sense to you.
I feel like I got diagnosed at almost a perfect time. And if that makes sense, it doesn't, but it does to me, because I got diagnosed, I was 28. It was the summer of 2019. And as I got diagnosed, I went to University of Penn and I was put on a chemo treatment plan. And afterwards, I found out that the doctor that had treated me there actually contacted Dr. Mark Yarchoan and asked him what drugs to give me. So I knew right then that he was the doctor to go to, that he knew more about the fibrolamellar cancer than a doctor at University of Penn did. So next time I got sick, I waited for a bed at Hopkins and immediately went there. And I would say within the first 2 hours of meeting Dr. Yarchoan, I knew that something was different, because I was given options. It wasn't just like, here are drugs. It was, let's talk about it. Let's discuss it. Let's figure out what our next step is. Let's get you healthy. Let's get you living. And then we'll go from there. And I think that was the most important part, because I realized, like, he wanted me to feel good. And it wasn't just about, oh, I'm another patient who feels like crap, let's put her on drugs and call it a day. I felt like there was actually a connection and humanity there. And then I would say the first time I met him, I was told about the clinical trial because he was so excited about it. It was, every person that I was introduced to was, oh, this person works with me on this trial. This person's going to work with me on the trial. And he was just so excited that it wasn't even FDA approved. He was waiting for the approval. It was maybe 6 months out. And I knew that if I was healthy enough to be a participant in it, all I had to do was last 6 months and I'd get there. And that's kind of what pushed me towards it, because I felt like the drugs I was being given, yes, they were keeping me stable, but the side effects were awful. And so I was willing to try anything different. And as soon as that trial opened and the drugs that I was on interferon and capecitabine or something like that. And as soon as I was able to join the trial, my life changed. It was everything. My tumor started to shrink. My side effects were next to nothing. I mean, I would get a sore in the vaccine site and that's about it. It changed my life. And I know that it didn't work for everybody, but it just makes me really excited to know that there could be a second part to it that just goes further and further.
Emily, thanks for that very much. And, just for completeness, I should say there are actually a number of physicians around the country and around the world who are doing interesting clinical studies in fibrolamellar. And I think there are others in addition to Mark who are making progress against this disease, which is really encouraging. And, it's fantastic to hear about the result you have, and it'll be a while before we actually get data on enough patients to know how general that's going to be. But
Sure.
But just it's we're all thrilled about the response you've had and how stable it's been so far. Yeah. So that's great.
It shrunk my tumors enough to where I was actually a candidate for surgery. Where when I was first diagnosed, I was told no surgery, you'll die if you have surgery. So that immediately changed things.
Thank you so much.
Mhm.
So let me turn to Kurt Losert, who's a colleague here in the Fibrolamellar Cancer Foundation. And as John said, his wife Elizabeth had a very long journey with fibrolamellar. Kurt, maybe you could walk us through again a little bit of that journey. And again, from the point of view is, when did you and Elizabeth decide that clinical trials were appropriate for you? And what was the thinking behind participating in those kinds of experiments? And with hindsight, is there anything you'd advise our patients and caregivers in the audience about how they might approach the clinical trial universe?
So, so my wife's journey was different than Emily's, obviously. It started out, she was diagnosed with fibrolamellar. She had a series of liver resections, then was deemed unresectable. She had radiofrequency ablation to get the tumors down to a tumor load that made her a candidate for liver transplant. She then had a liver transplant 2 years into the journey. And from that point forward, she had a liver that was free of disease. Unfortunately, a year or so after the transplant, it was clear that the cancer had spread. So she had metastases in her abdomen, in lungs, and eventually in her bones as well. With that, once the metastases were found, for a period of time, surgical treatment was an option. So she had a number of lung surgeries to remove 1 or 2 tumors that were surgically removable. She had abdominal surgery, removing tumors, general abdominal area. But at some point, especially with the lung, it became clear that she was no longer a surgical candidate. So at that point, we did a number of things. Traditional chemotherapy, at one point combined with radiation to try to kind of control some of the lung metastases, and then systemic treatments as well. We worked for a long time with 2 different oncologists, and a big part of our battle was having a great partnership with, we think, a wonderful oncologist who would sit down and think through with us what the options were that could potentially lead to a good outcome for Elizabeth. As a piece part of that, we did whatever sort of genomic analysis was available, with all the hospitals that she was treated at, Mass General, Memorial Sloan Kettering, Dana-Farber, independently with Foundation One, to see, is there any indication from her tumor on a type of systemic treatment that would be successful? Unfortunately, there wasn't. We actively looked at clinical trial options. So every fibrolamellar specific clinical trial that was available, we participated in, figuring that there was some sort of scientific rationale for those trials. So it was definitely worth a shot. So we did 2 with Dr. Abu Alpha at Memorial Sloan Kettering, one looking at everolimus and the other ENMD 2076. Neither of those were successful for Elizabeth, but we then, moved on to different options. So there were approved therapies for liver cancer in general. There were off-label drugs that we considered alongside our oncologist, and there were other clinical trials. And one of the clinical trials we stumbled upon that was being, one of the sites for it was at Mass General, so it was super convenient for us, was a phase 1 first-in-human dose escalation type trial. My wife was the 9th person ever to ingest that drug. It was very time consuming because no one had ever ingested that drug before. They started each group of 3 patients. The first 3 patients were at a super low dose. The next 3 patients were at a slightly higher dose. Elizabeth was in the 3rd group with an even higher dose. And because of the nature of the study, it was open to anyone with a solid tumor. It was in a class of drugs that, kinase inhibitors that we thought could potentially be effective against her cancer. And, we decided to enroll with the support of our oncologist. Elizabeth, on the basis of that, had nearly a year of shrinkage and stability. Just complete roll of the dice. No one knew how this drug would behave, in patients. No one knew about the safety of the drug. No one knew anything about the efficacy against this, any sort of cancer, never mind fibrolamellar. And, my wife happened to have a really good outcome. But because it was a phase 1 dose escalation trial, for the first several weeks, we were in the hospital lab every day with the blood drawn at a specific point in time, because they were really trying to figure out what was the impact of this drug in a human body, how is it metabolized, how long did it last, many, many, many questions that they were trying to answer about, how that particular drug interacted with the body. But, had a very satisfactory outcome from our perspective, since it gave my wife an additional year of life.
Thanks so much, Kurt, for sharing that. Richard, could I turn back to you? We've heard from 2 individuals who really have had, I think, a pretty remarkable balance and sense of expectation going into a trial about what it might or might not do for them, but managing patients' expectations and being fair to them, to give them good information about the potential benefits and the potential risks of the trial, is something that's sort of central to the IRB's role. Could you talk about what consent means and how it's designed to manage expectations and help patients to make an informed decision about whether to participate?
Well, the history, as I alluded to, goes back to some of the bad things that humans have done to one another over the centuries, including in World War II, which led to the formulation in most countries that do research with laws governing of how research with humans is done. Ours was passed in 1974, the National Research Act, and unusually, part of that act sort of assembled a commission of ethicists, religious leaders, to outline what should be the principles that govern such laws. This committee met in 1979. It's called the Belmont Committee. And anyone who sits on IRB has to read that document. These philosophers said, what should we worry about? What should we make sure happens? And they enumerated 3 principles that we as members of an IRB, a member sitting on a board, or the entities in themselves have to assure. And the first was autonomy. A human being should have autonomy. That is the ability to decide based on knowledge that's given to them in an appropriate way, what they want to do with themselves. That principle had been violated in many ways in the past. So if you're going to give someone autonomy to make a decision, you have to describe to them in terms that they can understand what you're going to do. And then without coercion, without any inducements, give them the opportunity to say yes or no. That's clear. And that happens. We always say consent is a document, but consent is a process that happens between 2 people. And if it's done well, it's the foundation of all human research. And clearly, from listening to Emily and Dr. Yarchoan, they had that exchange. And what it does is it creates trust and hope. And one of the things, we will go over these documents and protocols word by word if necessary to maximize the possibility that that's going to happen. Someone might listen and say, you know what, this isn't for me, but that's their right, and we have to protect that right. The second principle, the wise men of the Belmont report enumerated, was beneficence. That whatever you're doing has to be for the good, not just for humanity, but for the individual person. And that means that the scientists and the board that looks at their plan has to assure that to the extent we can know, and of course, a lot of these experiments are done because we don't know. If we knew, we wouldn't do them. In fact, Einstein, my favorite Einstein quote was, if we knew what we were doing, we wouldn't call it research. So to the extent we can, how can we minimize anything bad that could happen and maximize the good that can come? And that's what the FDA spends a lot of time doing when they look over all the data and application to use a drug. And the final principle is justice. That is, if there are risks and benefits to share in creating new knowledge, that we have to give everyone in our society the opportunity to partake of the benefits and take the risks. We just can't do it for rich people or people in one state or people of one age. For example, and you can't be overprotective and patronizing. For example, for a long time, we didn't know how drugs worked in children and women because scientists said, oh, we can't expose children to risk and we can't expose women to risk. But that was patronizing, and because they were excluded, it took a long time to learn how these drugs, many drugs, not just experimental cancer drugs. So that's our job. If we do our job right, everyone is protected to the maximum. Everyone's as satisfied with the maximum. And when you make a decision, and your comment about bravery of Emily struck me, because anyone in a clinical trial is like an explorer or pioneer, setting out into a new land. You don't know what's out there. It could be the promised land or it could be horrible danger. So you have to have a certain amount of belief that you're going to take that journey because you hope it's going to end in a good way. And we have, as the IRB, we participate as much as scientists do. If people have questions or issues, that you're not taking the journey alone. You have a partner. We're walking with you. And part of all of the things that both Kurt and Emily talked about, the frequent visits, the blood tests, the check-ins, the phone calls, the things that could seem burdensome, are actually done to make sure every single step of that journey is as safe as possible and it's never taken alone. So there is a burden in a clinical trial.
Real quick.
Sure.
I just want to say that when I took part in the clinical trial, I felt like I had the best care ever. Like I felt like I was like a rock star going in there every week because I felt like I was not given special treatment, but I was being seen one-on-one with each research nurse. My blood work was special. Everyone knew I was a research patient and that meant something special. And it made you feel like you were, not that I wasn't being taken care of before, but when you're in a clinical trial, you feel like everyone is making sure that every little thing that goes on in your life is being watched and taken care of for you. And I felt like I was taken care of more during that time than any other time ever. And I thought that was really special.
And I think that's one of the benefits of being a clinical trial. It's not like, as you said, it's not like the other doctors don't do a good job. But researchers have to do an extra special job. They watch everything because every clinical trial is certainly undertaken for one's own reasons, but every clinical trial has the benefit to create knowledge which benefits everything. And so even trials, even a phase 1 trial in a different context where we don't know anything about a drug, that if people are normal or they're healthy people participating, one of the benefits is that their risk is benefiting possibly other people. But you're right, it's not like going to the doctor for a sore throat when you're in a clinical trial.
Richard, thank you for that. And I'll say from your response, I think people will have an idea of why I was so happy to spend 15 years in the IRB that you chaired. I learned from it every time I came in, and I really felt like it was an important job, and your leadership was central to that.
Well, thank you. But you also are pretty darn smart and helped us out a lot.
Well, that's kind of you. Mark, a couple of questions have come up, and both in some of what we've heard already and in some of the Q&A from our attendees about some of the practical aspects of trials, and they include the criteria for patients being even eligible to participate, and then some of the rules specifically around exclusion. In the case of the trial you're running, there was a question about the rule about previous exposure to one of the classes of drugs that are given along with the peptide vaccine, the checkpoint inhibitors, and also citizenship, and I would add to that location. So who can participate? How do you set those eligibility criteria to meet the fairness and justice and safety kinds of concerns that Dr. Weinberg talked about? And when do you see the transition to make the eligibility perhaps a little bit less restrictive as we learn more about this therapy? Mark, you're still muted, I think.
Sorry, I just realized I'm muted. My apologies. Yeah, no, a lot to unpack there. Really good questions. I think people often think that the person running the trial has all the power, but believe it or not, there are many checks on clinical trials, which are there for the benefit of the patient for the most part, to make sure that the person running the trial, doesn't do something that could really jeopardize the participants. And so before you open a trial, you have to write a set of eligibility criteria. These are the patients who we're going to treat. That eligibility criteria doesn't just get approved by the clinical trial team, but gets approved by the IRB, which is an independent group of investigators like Dr. Weinberg, who just heard from, who make sure that the eligibility criteria make sense, they're safe. These are people who should be treated. That eligibility also has to be approved by the FDA. So those criteria are set ahead of time, and they're set up so that if you get a patient who you really want to treat, and this is the patient who you really want to put on the trial, you can't just put them on if they don't meet your criteria, even if you really want to treat them, because there's this whole group that is monitoring everything, and you can't really change the criteria midway. And those criteria are for the most part not arbitrary. And so, in this case, one of the criteria that we have for our trial is that patients can't have received a checkpoint inhibitor in the past. That criteria was really something that the FDA pushed us on because they felt that that patients, we didn't know if this extra vaccine would help, but at least patients would get checkpoint inhibitors, and it wouldn't be ethical to put someone on who's getting something they'd already had for a phase 1 trial. So there was, these are the sorts of concerns that were brought up. So, we certainly hope if this works, that this would be widely available. If it doesn't work, then at least the participants would have answered that question, and we're very grateful that they participated. So I hope that provides a little bit of background on how we see it as the people running the trial.
I could comment on that from our perspective. A lot of times, potential patients might think that both inclusion and exclusion criteria are unfair. Why won't you treat me? And that is, when we test medicines in the early stages, there are two mistakes that we don't want to make. And one of them is falsely assuming that the drug works when in actuality it's not going to. And then all of a sudden you have a lot of hope and you try the drug in a larger number of people and now it doesn't work. And the other mistake you don't want to make is saying, gee, I guess this didn't work because maybe you tested in people who had cancer at a certain stage or had other medicines before. And that's those mistakes which in statistics are called type 1 and type 2 errors. It's like throwing the baby out with the bath when you shouldn't have, and keeping the baby in the bath when you shouldn't have as well. We don't want to make those because both the FDA and any researcher, and when you talk to a patient, want to assure someone that we think this works. It's worked before. And there have been plenty of drugs in the past that look really promising in the beginning and then they didn't work too well. So that's why, and we have to explain this to people. Why can't you treat me? Why can't you make an exception? As soon as you start doing that after the fact, after everyone's set up how we're going to do this, now you're not so sure at the end if something worked or not.
One of the other points that brings up, and an area that we were always really appreciative of, kind of the partnership we had with our oncologist, is to try to map out what's a long-term treatment plan. Knowing that there are exclusion criteria, knowing that some of these clinical trials they're open now, they may not be open in 6 months. We, working with our oncologist, very specifically said, okay, even though we've got 2 or 3 ideas on off-label treatment options, we're gonna do this clinical trial now before we do one of those, because one of those other drugs may exclude you from the clinical trial, or the clinical trial opportunity may no longer be open. So, so to kind of have that notion of what's a step sequence of things you may do if the current treatment isn't successful is something that we really appreciated thinking through with our particular oncologist.
Thanks, Kurt. We have some kind of, I think, very specific questions about how long a patient has to be off current treatment plan, how long might they have been on a previous treatment plan. Just very generally, Mark, could you give us an idea of, first of all, is your trial still enrolling? And what do you do to, in a more general way of asking the same question, what do you do to have the best chance to be able to say that any effect you see really came from the trial medication and wasn't just sort of a holdover from previous treatment?
Yeah, 2 good questions. Our trial is still open, although we're pretty close to being done enrolling patients. So we anticipate being done with enrollment in the next couple months. In terms of, I think the point you brought up is the washout. So anytime that you have a clinical trial, you generally want people to have stopped their prior cancer therapy because, first of all, it'll tell you if the response you see is truly from your drug and not the drug before, but also because of safety, because you don't necessarily know how your drug would combine with whatever else patients have been on. I would say typically clinical trials require a couple of weeks of washout. That would be most typical. I think that the tricky thing is immunotherapies, because some of these checkpoint inhibitor drugs, when you get a dose, that dose can work for months. And so for immunotherapy trials, in general, there has to be several half-lives washout from a prior immunotherapy. So that's the one time where sometimes the washout's really long. But for chemotherapies or targeted therapies, usually it's just a couple weeks washout.
Thanks, Mark. Maybe for Kurt and Emily, and Emily, I don't know if you've really had the experience yet, but Kurt certainly did. So how do you actually collect as much information as you can about what trials are available or might become available? And how do you navigate the logistics of trials being sometimes at single centers, which could be distant from where you live? Is that something that's manageable? Is that a big handicap, or is that something that you were able to work through?
Luckily, I haven't had to run into any issues about like locations. I seem to be in a really good place where like I'm super close to Johns Hopkins. And so that's just, I kind of fell into it sort of. So luckily I haven't run into that yet.
Mm-hmm.
But again, if I get sick and Dr. Yarchoan decides there's somebody better out there that has a better trial or something like that, I would definitely relocate. It's life or death.
Yeah, we
What was
use
your
the
experience?
clinical trials website, clinicaltrials.gov, and that has a list of active recruiting, kind of pending clinical trials. We had, as I mentioned before, just ongoing communications. Every time we met with our oncologist, we were talking about how's the current treatment going, what are some ideas for future opportunities. My wife and I did a lot of research ourselves. We talked to anyone out there who could potentially guide us in an appropriate direction. So there's really a lot of outreach and communications. In terms of the logistics of the trial itself, we were fortunate. We lived in suburban Massachusetts. So Mass General, Dana-Farber, a lot of world-class research institutions right there. But there were a couple of trials that we ended up going down to New York City to do at Memorial Sloan Kettering. They weren't open in Boston, but again, living in the Northeast, getting from Boston to New York is fairly easy logistically.
Right.
One of the pieces of advice that I give patients when they come to see me for a clinical trial is, I really encourage them to talk to their oncologist who's not involved in the clinical trial. Now, Emily's a little bit of an exception here because she's been my patient before the trial even existed. But when patients come to see me as a second opinion and they ask me, what do you have to offer? I think it's helpful to have somebody who's not directly involved in the clinical trial and doesn't have kind of academic conflicts of interest in the trial to really be a sounding board independent of the trial team. And those of us who treat fibrolamellar cancer, we have a pretty good sense of what's going on, what the options are out there. All of us talk, but I think it's good to, ask around. And if you're interested in a trial, make sure that the local oncologist or whoever is treating and has known you the longest thinks it makes sense in terms of your broader plan.
I think that's great advice, Mark. Thanks. And let me throw one more question, particularly to Mark and Richard. So you get to the point where you've enrolled the number of patients that you set out as your original target. You've got data. When do you disclose that data? To whom do you disclose it? And what's the next step? And when if the treatment starts to look promising, how does it become available to more people, either in the next trial phase or even beyond that, to become part of a standard of care?
Yeah, this is such a good question because, so many clinical trials that have happened have never been reported. This is a huge problem. So, patients risk their lives to participate in a trial. And often drug companies will run the trial. It won't work as well as they hoped, and they just bury the trial data and never publish it. It's a huge problem. And there have been some laws passed actually to try to prevent this from happening. And so now when you conduct a clinical trial, the government actually requires that you put some of the data from the trial into clinicaltrials.gov to make that data publicly available in a timely manner. I can say for our trial, as soon as we feel that we have data that can be shared, we'll be happy to share it. We're not going to sit on this. We understand the urgency. Richard, I don't know if you want to add something to that.
Sure. Depending on the disease, the novelty of the drug, who developed it, a scientist at a university versus a drug company. These things are managed by the IRB and the FDA in a way that, again, tries to maximize the safety of the subjects and the value. Large trials where many people are getting a drug are very often supervised by yet another safety mechanism called the Data Safety Monitoring Committee. These are independent people who are specifically chosen to have scientific expertise, but absolutely no connection to the drug company, to the scientist, to the institution. And they have the sole ability to look at the data. And some of these trials, if you're in a phase 3 trial, one of the most stringent types of phase 3 trials is called the double-blinded trial, where no one knows who's getting the active drug or not, to remove any possible bias. The Data Safety and Monitoring Committee can look at that data, and they have the power to say, you know what, you've been going, I know it's a 5-year trial, but we've looked at the data and this just isn't working. So it's now unethical to continue this trial when we know it's not working. The converse is also true. And this goes on with multiple, any phase of research. If folks look at the data and say, oh my goodness, this is working better than we could have possibly dreamed. Everyone who gets this is getting better. Then similarly, it's unethical to continue the trial with a control where someone's not getting it. So we have committees that have the power to look at data and make stopping reasonable. And most studies have statisticians who can tell us, if you have a new drug, let's say it wasn't a rare disease, say the first time I want to try this drug, let's try it on 10,000 people. And the statistician will say, no, that's an unreasonable risk. So even in the design, we will have folks who are experts in biostatistics advising us, how many people do you really need to answer the question without exposing people to bad risk if it doesn't work, or without withholding the treatment from people if it does? And this type of advice comes to us very early. So again, all in the interest of safety and getting the right answer.
Right. We didn't talk about it, but another factor that plays into that is people have financial interests in the outcomes of clinical trials. And maybe just say a word about how does one both make sure those aren't biasing the apparent outcome or the way the trial is run, and also what can be done to induce a patient, or what should not be done to induce a patient to participate in the trial.
Well, part of autonomy is not being coerced. And for example, a lot of these rules came from all of the atrocities that occurred in World War II from the Nazis. Those unfortunate people had no choice. For at least a century, medical studies were done on prisoners, and we don't do that anymore because they do not have autonomy. Part of what we do in IRB is make sure there's no coercion. That means you can't offer $1 million to be on our trial. There's other forms of coercion that we look at very carefully. Now, in terms of the other side that you just mentioned, conflict of interest, there are many famous cases I could discuss. We have a lecture on them, where scientists were so blinded by their own self-interest that they didn't really do a good job explaining the risks and benefits of their trial. For example, if a scientist develops a drug, forms a company, he's the CEO of some wonder drug, We're not going to let that scientist conduct his own trial. He's intrinsically biased. He wants it to work, so he'll make $1 million. So there are ways, it's called conflict of interest. Everyone who does any clinical study, even if I'm looking at someone's charts, has to sign a statement divulging what could be a conflict of interest or not. This goes financial, it goes political, there are many different types of interests. And there are ways of managing it. For example, the example of the scientist who develops a blockbuster drug, we can use that scientist's drug in the trial, but that scientist can't run the trial. You'll have to find someone else to do it. So this is a concept that's relatively new and actually came to light several decades after the IRB system was installed. But again, it's not fair. It's not just if someone sells you a bill of goods for a study because they have their own personal interest. That's not just. So there are systems in place to prevent that as well.
Thanks for
The
that.
one thing I would just, very quickly add is conflict of interest is something that's very important. And there's a big emphasis now on financial conflicts of interest, meaning, do the doctors that run a clinical trial stand to financially benefit if the trial works? But, I think people don't talk as much about other conflicts of interest. And I think the biggest one that is worth mentioning is sort of this conflict of academic ascension. Now, what does that mean? It means if this trial works, my career is probably going to go better than if it doesn't work. And so even someone like me, where I have no illusion of making any money off of, a vaccine for fibrolamellar cancer, I am conflicted in some way. And I think that it's important that, patients, recognize that everyone has conflicts, and it's important to really talk to not just one doctor running a trial, but also, your home team to make sure that the trial really makes sense.
Thanks, Mark. We're getting close to the period where I was hoping we'd be focusing primarily on questions from the audience. We don't have a lot of those showing up on the screen. So let me ask those of you who are attendees, if you do have a question, this is a great time to put it into the Q&A. And we'll just give a couple of minutes for any more to pop up. Kurt, maybe I could turn back to you and just, again, because you had such a long experience with Elizabeth and were involved with many different institutions. When did the logistics become more difficult? I know that geographically you were favored, but were there things that you would recommend to patients and their caregivers to make that journey easier for them and to be able to navigate it more effectively?
I'm not sure so in terms of, what are things that can really help you manage logistical situations?
Yeah, at the most practical level, to get to the trials you thought might be medically most appropriate at the right time. And were there financial issues involved? Were there costs that you had to bear? And
yeah, so
Emily, same question to you.
So all the clinical trials that we participated in were at no cost to us. So the care, and I'd really echo what Emily said earlier. When my wife was in a clinical trial, we thought we were cared for, superbly, and we not only had our traditional team of oncologists and medical support, but we had the clinical trial team as well. All that came in the trials that we participated in at no cost to us. In terms of transportation and travel, we never took advantage of or needed to take advantage of some of these opportunities because it was fairly easy for us. But there are many, many resources, whether it's Ronald McDonald House, whether it's different organizations that help provide housing at treatment centers for people who are coming a long distance, at no cost or at a reduced cost. And generally, when you're dealing with a major medical center, there's someone there who can help you navigate some of the local resources. Fibrolamellar Cancer Foundation has some of these listed on our website as well. In terms of transportation, there are free travel options. There are a number of private jet services that offer free transportation to patients when it's medically necessary, and that would include things like clinical trials. So owners of aircraft fleets, companies donate some of the excess time that's not used on their aircraft, and patients and their families can use it to travel to a medical center that's not convenient for them. So there are resources over and above what clinical trial themselves could provide that can really help break down some of those especially financial barriers for different patients and their families.
Okay, thank you. One question that popped up from one of our attendees, good friend Tom Stockwell, is about what's sometimes called an N of 1 trial, or also known sometimes as compassionate use or extended access. Richard or Mark, could you just take a minute and talk about when is it appropriate to give trial to a single to give experimental therapy to a single individual, and what are the rules for that, and how does it sort of fit in with the bigger picture of trials where you're trying to get statistically significant data?
Well, there's a bunch of factors that go into that decision that's usually jointly made between the investigator, the FDA, and the IRB. One is the seriousness of the situation. Another is the availability or not of alternative approaches to that situation. And the final one is if there have been any encouraging results of a drug that's not approved. If those all converge, then it's more likely than not that permission will be granted to use an experimental agent in an individual circumstance. And I can also add that the further along the drug is in the approval process, again, that's a factor that goes into it.
Thank you. Folks, we're not seeing further questions from the attendees. Let me just quickly ask if each of you would like to take a minute, if there are any last thoughts that you'd like to share, and then we'll thank everybody for the participation. Richard, would you like to be the first on that? Is there any last words of wisdom?
I guess the last word of wisdom I would have is it's a scary process to be in a clinical trial, particularly with serious disease, and with some of our new drugs have incredible power, and that we haven't learned to harness. Some of the immunotherapies, has been mentioned, can have long-lasting effects. I think it's important for everyone to know that aside from the people you see who are talking to you and caring for you, there is a huge number of people behind the scenes, the IRB, the FDA, the data safety monitoring committees, who have the same goals as you, that it's going to work out well and it's going to work out safely.
I just take a slightly counter point of view. I thought my wife's participation in clinical trials was no scarier than any other part of the disease battle, just because you're getting a whole other team of coverage and support. You know that there's been the IRB approval, there's a whole process that's undergone to make sure that the clinical trial is managed as safely as possible. And on the drug that my wife was the 9th person ever to ingest, being in the hospital every day, dealing with the medical team involved in the trial, we had utmost confidence that if there were anything that would begin to go awry, that we'd know about it, our participation at that point would have ended. So, so I don't view our clinical trial participation as any more scary. And in some ways, it's actually less scary than the rest of our battle against a disease that doesn't have a standard of care.
Well, I don't think our positions are, I think they're the same. If it wasn't scary for you, it was because you were aware of these things. And my point is, you're a very sophisticated, experienced clinical trialer, if I could say that, and you learn these things. For people who've never even thought about it before, I just want to reassure them that what you see is the tip of the iceberg of the people who care about you.
Yes, yes, and yes. Emily, anything you'd like to add?
No, just I appreciate the opportunity to share my story, and I hope that somebody learned something from something I've said. That's all.
Well, and thank you again for doing exactly that. And you know, it's just great to see how well you're doing. And Mark, any last
I
thoughts?
appreciate everybody's hard work.
No, I think I think that clinical trials are an amazing partnership, not just with patients and physicians, but again, a whole team of people, the IRB, the scientists who did all the generation of data that led to the clinical trial, the people who funded the trial. In our case, the Fibrolamellar Cancer Foundation was one of the sources that supported our trial. So we thank you for that. So it's really exciting that there's been real progress, I think, in this cancer, and hopefully more to come.
Well, on that hopeful note, I'd like to thank again all of our participants and attendees, and just hope that the direction continues and we continue to make this kind of progress against fibrolamellar. Thank you.
Thank you, panelists. Thank you, everybody. Knowledge is power. Remember that. Take care.
Take care.